I am Valerie, 34 years old, and the founder of a luxury estate staging firm in Manhattan. On my birthday, my sister's daughter tossed a glass of red wine on my custom outfit and said, "Now you look as cheap as you really are." My mother took her side, complaining that I was making a scene. I simply smiled, paid for my appetizer in cash, and walked out. That night, I logged into my banking app and canceled my sister's platinum credit card. But the real surprise came the next morning when my niece woke up to find her $60,000 convertible missing from her driveway. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to a toxic family who took your success for granted. The crystal chandeliers cast a warm, expensive glow over our private table. I had booked this dinner weeks in advance to celebrate my 34th birthday, foolishly hoping that an elegant, high-end setting might encourage my family to act with some basic human decency. I sat in my custom-tailored cream silk suit, a gift to myself, after closing a massive staging contract for a luxury penthouse in Tribeca. My older sister, Victoria, the undisputed golden child of our family, sat across from me swirling her third glass of vintage Pinot Noir. Next to her was her 17-year-old daughter, Harper, who spent the entire evening rolling her eyes and aggressively tapping on her phone screen. The evening had already been a masterclass in passive aggression. Victoria spent the appetizers loudly bragging about her husband Marcus and his real estate deals, while my mother Patricia continuously steered the conversation away from my business expansion. Whenever I tried to mention my new warehouse space or my growing team of employees, Patricia would interrupt with a sigh and ask the waiter for more bread. When the main courses finally arrived, Harper suddenly stood up to take a selfie for her social media. In doing so, she bumped the heavy oak table violently. Her hand swiped directly into her overflowing glass of red wine, sending a dark crimson wave splashing directly across the front of my pristine cream silk suit. The cold liquid soaked through the delicate fabric instantly. I gasped, pushing my chair back abruptly as the wine dripped onto the plush restaurant carpet. The surrounding tables seemed to fall completely silent. I looked at Harper, waiting for the inevitable apology, waiting for the embarrassment any normal teenager would feel after ruining an expensive outfit. Instead, Harper looked down at my stained chest, let out a sharp laugh, and looked me dead in the eye. "Now you look as cheap as you really are," she sneered, holding her phone up. I stood perfectly still, the cold wine clinging to my skin. I turned my gaze to my mother, waiting for her to reprimand her granddaughter for such a vicious, unprovoked attack. Instead, Patricia reached over with her linen napkin and began frantically dabbing a tiny, completely invisible drop of wine off of Harper's dress. "Oh, do not make a scene, Valerie," my mother sighed, not even bothering to look up. "It was just an accident. You are always so incredibly dramatic. When you were Harper's age, you wore Victoria's faded hand-me-downs for years, and you survived just fine. A little wine will wash right out. Besides, you are the one who insisted on booking this overpriced, cramped restaurant in the first place. It is your fault for making everyone so tense and uncomfortable." Victoria let out a loud, ringing laugh, leaning back in her upholstered chair and sipping from her freshly poured glass. "Mom is exactly right, Val. Do not ruin the birthday mood over a silly outfit. Just go to the bathroom and scrub it out in the sink. We are getting ready to order more wine, and we want to look at the dessert menu." The familiar toxic burn of injustice flared in my chest. For decades, I had swallowed their casual insults to keep the peace. I had allowed them to treat my actual accomplishments like trivial hobbies, while they worshipped the ground Victoria walked on. But as I looked down at the dark red stain spreading across my chest, the desperate need for their approval simply evaporated. I did not yell. I did not cry. I picked up my designer clutch, pulled out exactly enough cash to cover my single appetizer and one glass of sparkling water, and placed the crisp green bills neatly on the direct center of the table. "What are you doing?" Victoria asked, her smug smile faltering slightly as I stepped away from the table. "I am going home," I said, my voice perfectly level and terrifyingly calm. "Enjoy the rest of your evening. And Victoria, you might want to pace yourselves with the vintage bottles. The bill is already over $3,200. My mother scoffed loudly, her face flushing red. Stop throwing a childish tantrum and sit back down. You know you are paying for this dinner. It is your birthday party. Not anymore, I replied smoothly. I turned my back on them and walked out the heavy glass doors into the cool Manhattan night. I left them sitting there staring at the mounting bill they had fully expected me to cover. But that was only the very beginning of my response to their cruelty. At exactly midnight, sitting alone in my quiet penthouse overlooking the glittering city skyline, I opened my secure banking application. I navigated straight to the authorized user accounts. For 10 long years, I had quietly funded Victoria's lavish lifestyle to maintain family harmony. With one deliberate tap on my phone screen, I permanently canceled the platinum credit card currently sitting in her wallet. Then I picked up my phone and dialed a 24-hour private towing company to handle a very specific high-end asset recovery. At exactly 8:50 the next morning, my cell phone shattered the quiet elegance of my staging showroom. I was reviewing fabric swatches for a multi-million-dollar property in the hills when Victoria's name flashed across the screen. I swiped to answer and immediately held the phone an inch away from my ear. Harper was wailing in the background, a high-pitched, hysterical sound that echoed through the receiver. "My car is gone," she shrieked, her voice cracking with raw panic. "Someone stole it right out of the driveway." Victoria snatched the phone from her daughter. Her tone was venomous and sharp. "Valerie, you need to get over here right now. Harper is completely traumatized. We are calling the police and I expect you to pay for a rental car until they find it. You are the one who told us to park it on the street last night because of the street sweepers." I took a slow sip of my espresso, savoring the rich roast. "I did tell you to park it on the street," I replied smoothly. It made the pickup infinitely easier for the tow truck driver. Dead silence filled the line for a fraction of a second before Victoria exploded. "You towed her car. Are you out of your mind? I am calling the police right now and reporting you for grand theft auto. You are going to prison, you jealous, pathetic psycho." She slammed the phone down. I set my device on the marble desk and returned to my fabric swatches, completely unbothered by her empty threats. Less than 40 minutes later, the heavy glass doors of my showroom swung open. Two uniformed officers stepped into the reception area looking stern and ready for a major confrontation. My assistant pointed them toward my glass-enclosed office. I stood up and greeted them with a polite, professional smile. "Officers, how can I help you this morning?" I asked, gesturing for them to take a seat. The older officer held a notepad, looking me over with a hint of heavy skepticism. "Mom, we received a report from a Victoria claiming you orchestrated the theft of a BMW convertible belonging to her daughter. Auto theft is a very serious felony." I maintained steady eye contact and pulled a neatly organized file folder from my locked desk drawer. I opened it and laid 3 documents face up on the pristine glass surface. "I did not steal anything, officer," I explained calmly. "I simply repossessed company property. That vehicle is registered to my limited liability company. I bought it in cash 2 years ago. I allowed my niece to use it as a privilege. Last night, she decided to destroy a custom silk suit of mine and my sister felt no discipline was required. So I immediately revoked the driving privilege." The officers leaned forward, examining the vehicle title, the corporate registration, and the insurance policy. All 3 bore my company name and my direct signature. Victoria and Harper were nowhere on the legal paperwork. The younger officer shook his head, a faint smile breaking through his serious professional demeanor. He tapped the registration document with his metal pen. "So the mother reported a stolen vehicle when she knew it belonged to you." I nodded, folding my hands gently on the desk. "She assumed because I let them use it that it belonged to them. My sister has a terrible habit of claiming ownership over expensive things I pay for." The older officer let out a heavy sigh, pulling out his radio to officially cancel the stolen vehicle alert. He then asked for Victoria's cell phone number. I recited it from memory and watched as he put his phone on speaker so we could all hear. Victoria answered on the very first ring, her voice dripping with artificial distress. "Officer, did you arrest her yet?" The officer leaned into the speaker. "Ma'am, we are currently sitting with your sister. We have reviewed the legal title and registration for the vehicle in question. It is solely owned by her corporate entity. Filing a false police report is a serious crime. If you waste police resources again with a fraudulent claim, we will be issuing a warrant for your arrest." Victoria gasped, the sound sharp and incredibly indignant. "That is our car!" she screamed loudly. "She gave it to us. We have rights. You have absolutely no legal rights to the vehicle, Mom," the officer stated firmly. "Do not call this precinct regarding this specific car again." He ended the call abruptly, cutting off her screeching protests. They handed the documents back to me, apologized for the interruption, and walked out of my showroom. While Victoria was screaming at a disconnected dial tone, her husband Marcus was across town at an exclusive country club. Marcus prided himself on his impeccable image. As a luxury real estate broker, his entire brand relied on projecting limitless wealth and untouchable success. He was currently hosting a lavish brunch for 3 major international investors, aiming to secure a massive commercial development deal. They dined on imported caviar and drank premium champagne. When the enormous check arrived, Marcus smoothly pulled out his heavy metal platinum credit card and placed it on the silver tray with a practiced, confident smile. He continued discussing square footage and zoning permits while the waiter stepped away to process the transaction. 5 minutes later, the waiter returned. His expression was polite, but his voice carried clearly across the quiet, elegant dining room. "Sir, I am incredibly sorry, but this card has been declined." Marcus froze, his confident smile slipping instantly. He let out a forced, awkward chuckle, waving his hand dismissively. "Just a bank security measure," he told his wealthy clients, pulling out a second card linked to the exact same joint account. "Try this one, please." The waiter returned 90 seconds later, holding the second card out. "Declined again, sir." Marcus felt pure humiliation as his important client stared at him. I stared down at Patricia writhing on my office floor. She was giving an Oscar-worthy performance, clutching her chest and gasping for imaginary air. Victoria immediately dropped to her knees beside her mother, shrieking at the top of her lungs. She pulled out her phone with trembling hands and dialed emergency services, screaming that her mother was having a massive, fatal heart attack. I did not move a single muscle to help. I simply stood behind my oak desk, watching the pathetic theatrical display unfold. Within 10 minutes, the wail of sirens pierced the morning air outside my showroom. 4 paramedics rushed through the glass doors carrying a stretcher and a barrage of medical equipment. They practically shoved me aside to get to Patricia, who had miraculously found the strength to moan loudly the moment the uniformed men entered the room. They strapped an oxygen mask over her face and loaded her onto the gurney. Victoria grabbed her designer purse and ran out behind them, hurling one final venomous glare in my direction. I took a slow, deep breath, straightened my suit jacket, and calmly locked my office door. I decided to follow them to the hospital, not out of daughterly concern, but to personally witness the inevitable medical conclusion of this ridiculous charade. The emergency room waiting area was a sterile, depressing expanse of gray linoleum and uncomfortable vinyl chairs. The sharp smell of antiseptic hung heavy in the freezing air. When I walked through the sliding automatic doors, I immediately spotted Victoria pacing frantically near the triage desk. She was sobbing loudly, demanding updates from every passing nurse. Standing in the far opposite corner, completely detached from the hysterical scene, was Marcus. His face was carved from absolute stone. His arms were tightly crossed over his broad chest. He was clearly only present because abandoning his mother-in-law during a medical emergency would ruin his pristine public image. But he refused to offer Victoria even a shred of physical or emotional comfort. He did not look at her. He did not speak to her. He just stared blankly at the wall, processing the monumental betrayal he had just uncovered. I took a seat on the opposite side of the room, pulling out my phone to check my business emails. I refused to participate in their manufactured panic. 20 minutes later, the main emergency room doors forcefully flew open. My father, Richard, stormed into the waiting area like a hurricane of pure, unadulterated rage. Richard was a tall, imposing man who had spent his entire life dominating boardrooms and crushing anyone who dared to question his supreme authority. He had always viewed me as a stubborn, rebellious disappointment, simply because I refused to blindly follow his aggressive demands. He marched past the triage desk, his heavy footsteps echoing loudly against the tile floor. He completely bypassed his weeping golden child, Victoria. He did not even glance at Marcus standing rigidly in the corner. His furious eyes locked directly onto me. He crossed the room in seconds and planted himself directly in front of my chair, looming over me with a face completely flushed with rage. "You are an absolute monster!" he roared, his voice echoing through the quiet waiting room, causing several nurses to turn their heads in alarm. I slowly looked up from my phone, meeting his furious gaze with absolute, unshakable calm. I did not stand up. I did not shrink back. I just stared at him. "What kind of degenerate psychopath attacks her own mother?" he screamed, pointing a thick finger inches from my face. "Victoria called me from the ambulance. She told me exactly what you did. You intentionally provoked her. You cornered her in your office and attacked her with those fabricated financial documents until her heart literally gave out. You put your own mother in a hospital bed, Valerie. You caused this heart attack out of sheer bitter jealousy because you cannot stand seeing your sister happy." I slowly placed my phone inside my purse and finally stood up, smoothing out the wrinkles in my custom skirt. "I did not fabricate anything, Richard," I replied, my voice completely devoid of emotion. "I simply cut off the unlimited funding I was unknowingly providing for your wife and your favorite daughter. Patricia is not having a heart attack. She is throwing a medical temper tantrum because she finally got caught stealing millions of dollars from my business accounts. She is hiding behind a hospital gown to avoid facing the reality of her own massive theft." Richard raised his hand to point at me again, his face turning an alarming shade of purple, but a sharp throat clearing interrupted his tirade. We all turned to see a tall, exhausted-looking emergency room doctor standing near the double-swinging doors. He held a metal clipboard in his hand, and he looked incredibly deeply annoyed. "Family of Patricia?" he asked, his tone flat and completely unimpressed. Victoria practically sprinted across the room, grabbing the doctor's arm. "I am her daughter," she cried out. "Please tell me she's going to survive. We need the best cardiologists immediately." The doctor gently but firmly removed Victoria's hand from his sleeve. He looked down at his clipboard and let out a heavy, exhausted sigh. "Your mother is perfectly fine," he announced, his voice dripping with pure medical irritation. "Her heart is perfectly healthy, her blood pressure is entirely normal, and her oxygen levels are flawless. She did not have a heart attack. She had a mild panic attack, which she heavily exaggerated for reasons I will leave to you to figure out. Right now, she is sitting up in bed loudly demanding room service and a private VIP suite. We are discharging her immediately because we need this bed for actual emergencies." The doctor turned on his heel and walked away, leaving absolute stunning silence in his wake. Victoria stood completely frozen, her jaw hanging open in pure shock as her mother's grand performance was completely exposed. Marcus let out a harsh, bitter laugh from his corner, shaking his head in pure disgust before turning around and walking straight out of the hospital without saying a single word to his wife. I looked at Richard, raising one single eyebrow. I let out a sharp scoff of utter disgust. Just as I suspected, I stated coldly, "A complete and utter waste of my time." I turned on my heel, grabbing my purse, preparing to leave this miserable, toxic circus behind me forever. I took 2 steps toward the sliding glass exit doors, but Richard suddenly lunged forward, stepping heavily into my path. He blocked my exit, his chest heaving with unresolved anger and a new desperate agenda. He reached inside his tailored suit coat and pulled out a thick, folded legal document. He shoved it violently against my chest, forcing me to grab it before it hit the floor. "Since you are so intent on destroying this family," he snarled, his voice dropping to a vicious, threatening tone, "sign this right now to make things right." I slowly unfolded the heavy, cream-colored paper Richard had just forcefully shoved against my chest. The hospital corridor was buzzing with nurses and patients, but my entire focus narrowed down to the dense legal jargon printed on the pages before me. I scanned the first few paragraphs, my eyes darting across the familiar names and legal stipulations. It was a formal, retroactive waiver of rights. Specifically, it was a waiver regarding my late grandfather's estate. The document was meticulously drafted to completely sever my legal claim to my rightful 50% share of his assets, effectively transferring every single penny real estate holding and investment portfolio directly into Victoria's name. I looked up from the pages, staring directly into Richard's bloodshot eyes. "You actually brought a legal waiver to an emergency room?" I asked, my voice echoing with pure disbelief. "You staged this entire pathetic medical emergency to guilt me into signing away my grandfather's inheritance." Richard stepped closer, using his massive frame to physically intimidate me. His face was a mask of furious entitlement. "You owe us, Valerie," he growled, his voice vibrating with absolute malice. "We took you in. We put a roof over your head. We fed you and clothed you while you were growing up in our house. You have millions of dollars sitting in your corporate accounts, while your sister is about to lose everything because of your vindictive little stunt today. You are going to sign that waiver right now and make this family whole again. You are going to repay your debt." I looked down at the document again, feeling a profound sense of clarity wash over me. For years, they had used this exact tactic. They weaponized guilt and duty to extract whatever they wanted. They genuinely believed I was nothing more than an endless financial resource bound to them by a distorted sense of familial obligation. My grandfather was the only person in this family who actually saw my potential. He left me that 50% share because he knew I would build something real with it. He knew Patricia and Richard would squander it on shallow status symbols just like they did with the rest of their money. I did not owe them a single dime. I owed them absolutely nothing. I grasped the top of the thick legal document with both hands. I locked eyes with my father, maintaining a completely stoic expression. Then, with one swift, aggressive motion, I ripped the heavy parchment right down the middle. The sound of tearing paper was incredibly loud in the quiet hospital corridor. Richard gasped, taking a stunned step backward, as if I had physically struck him. I placed the two torn halves together and ripped them again, reducing the carefully drafted legal contract into meaningless quarters. I let the shredded pieces slip from my fingers, watching them flutter down to the sterile linoleum floor, landing directly on top of his expensive Italian leather shoes. "If you want to steal my inheritance, Richard, you are going to need a much better lawyer," I stated coldly. My voice was steady and completely devoid of fear. "And you are going to need a much better strategy than faking a heart attack in the middle of a workday. Do not ever approach me again. Do not call my office. Do not step foot near my properties. We are entirely finished." I turned my back on him without waiting for a response. I walked away, hearing him shouting furious, empty threats behind me, but I did not stop. I pushed through the sliding glass exit doors and stepped out into the crisp afternoon air. The toxic heavy weight that had been suffocating me for decades finally lifted off my shoulders. I felt an incredible, overwhelming sense of freedom. I had finally severed the absolute last chain binding me to their miserable existence. The drive back to my house was peaceful. I rolled down the windows, letting the cool breeze clear my mind. I mentally prepared myself to call my wealth manager to officially finalize the lock on all my accounts and completely block any further withdrawal attempts from Patricia. I was ready to enjoy a quiet evening and celebrate my newly reclaimed independence. I pulled into my pristine driveway, parked my car, and walked through the front door. The house was perfectly silent. I dropped my keys on the entryway console and pulled my phone out of my purse to check my missed calls. My screen was completely frozen, illuminated by an endless cascading waterfall of notifications. My phone vibrated so aggressively, it nearly slipped out of my hand. I unlocked the screen and opened my business email first. My inbox was overflowing with urgent alerts from my staging company's public relations management software. I clicked on the first notification and my heart instantly dropped into my stomach. My company's official social media pages were being absolutely decimated. Hundreds of one-star reviews were flooding in by the second. The comments were incredibly vicious and completely unhinged. They called me a thief. They called me an evil sociopath. They warned every major real estate broker in the city to never hire my firm again. My flawless 5-star business rating, the reputation I had spent years meticulously building, was dropping at a terrifying speed. My phone buzzed again with a direct text message from my assistant. The message contained a single panicked sentence and a direct link to TikTok. I clicked the link, watching the app open on my screen. Harper's face immediately appeared. She was sitting in her lavishly decorated bedroom, her makeup deliberately smudged to make her look like she had been crying for hours. She stared directly into the camera, her bottom lip trembling with a perfectly practiced look of absolute devastation. The video already had over 2 million views, and a massive red banner across the top read, "Exposing my evil aunt." "Hi, everyone." Harper started, her voice cracking with manufactured grief. "I never thought I would have to make a video like this, but my family is being completely destroyed by my rich, evil aunt, Valerie. She just illegally stole my entire college fund. She hired a tow truck to repossess my only car out of pure spite, leaving me completely stranded. She is a millionaire who hates seeing anyone else happy, and she is trying to leave my family completely destitute. Please share this video and do not ever support her staging business." I stared at the screen, watching the view count climb higher and higher by the second. It was a masterclass in modern digital manipulation. Harper had perfectly positioned her ring light to catch the fake tears tracking down her cheeks. Her voice broke at precisely the right moments as she wove a completely fabricated tale of sudden, devastating poverty. She claimed I had drained her college savings out of petty spite. She claimed she would be sleeping on the streets because I had ruthlessly stolen the car her parents bought for her. She was a phenomenal actress, but I noticed her eyes flicking slightly to the left, reading a script her mother had undoubtedly written for her just out of frame. Pinned at the very top of the comment section, glowing in bright blue text, was a GoFundMe link titled, "Help Harper Survive Her Aunt's Greed." The funding goal was set at an astronomical $100,000, and gullible, sympathetic strangers were already flooding the account with donations. $10 here, $50 there, all accompanied by furious comments demanding my immediate arrest. My phone vibrated aggressively in my palm, completely interrupting the video. It was not another unhinged text from Victoria. The caller ID displayed the name of my largest corporate client, a prominent luxury real estate developer who relied heavily on my staging firm for his most lucrative properties. I took a steadying breath and answered with my usual crisp, professional tone. "Valerie." He began, his voice thick with uncharacteristic hesitation. "We are seeing some incredibly concerning activity online regarding your business. My marketing team just flagged a massive wave of 1-star reviews hitting your company profiles, and there is a viral video circulating with some very severe allegations. We have a $15 million open house scheduled for next week. I need to know if your firm is facing bankruptcy or legal trouble, because I cannot have my properties associated with a toxic public scandal." I did not panic. I did not raise my voice or offer emotional excuses. I spoke with absolute, unshakable authority. "There is absolutely no legal trouble or bankruptcy on the horizon," I assured him smoothly. "What you are seeing is a coordinated, malicious defamation campaign orchestrated by estranged family members attempting to extort me. They are utilizing paid bots to flood my business pages with fake reviews. My legal team is already initiating swift, aggressive action to dismantle the entire operation. Your open house will be staged flawlessly, and this background noise will be legally silenced before the weekend." The absolute certainty in my voice instantly diffused his anxiety. He let out a heavy sigh of relief, apologized for doubting my stability, and ended the call. I set my phone down and immediately dialed my corporate attorney, Sterling. Sterling was a ruthless, brilliant legal shark who handled my most complex business contracts, and he absolutely despised fraudulent extortion. He answered immediately, and I gave him a concise, detailed summary of the entire situation. I told him about the towed car, the fake heart attack, the shredded waiver in the hospital, and the current digital smear campaign. I sent him the link to Harper's tearful video and the direct link to the GoFundMe campaign. Sterling let out a low whistle over the line. "They are incredibly foolish, Valerie," he stated, his voice radiating cold professional anticipation. "Defamation and tortious interference with your business are serious civil offenses, but setting up a fraudulent crowdfunding campaign crosses a massive legal line. We are not going to validate this pathetic high school drama with a public response video. We are going to completely obliterate them financially and legally. I am putting my forensic accounting team on this immediately. We will run a deep background check on every single digital footprint they have left behind today." I spent the next 3 hours sitting in my quiet, immaculate home office, sipping sparkling water and watching the chaotic digital storm rage outside my walls. I did not feel a single ounce of fear. I felt the cold, calculating patience of a predator watching its prey blindly step into a steel trap. Victoria and Richard genuinely believed they could bully me into submission by leveraging public outrage. They thought they could weaponize internet sympathy to destroy my livelihood. They fundamentally failed to realize that the internet leaves an indelible, permanent paper trail, and my legal team was expertly trained to follow the money. My phone finally rang again. Sterling's name flashed across the screen and I answered instantly. The smug satisfaction in his voice was unmistakable. "You are going to love this, Valerie," he announced, dropping the professional formalities entirely. They walked right into a federal crime. I leaned forward, resting my elbows on my marble desk. "Tell me everything," I demanded, my voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. My forensic team pulled the digital routing information connected to the GoFundMe account. Sterling explained, his words clipping with rapid excitement. "In order to withdraw funds from a campaign, you have to link a verified active bank account. Victoria and Harper are completely stupid. They did not link it to Harper's checking account. They did not even link it to a standard domestic savings account under Victoria's name to simulate a legitimate college fund. They thought they were being incredibly clever by hiding the financial trail behind layers of corporate bureaucracy." "Where is the money going, Sterling?" I asked, my heart beating with cold anticipation. "The payout routing numbers trace back to a private shell corporation," Sterling revealed, dropping the ultimate bombshell. "That corporation serves as a blind funnel feeding directly into a high-risk offshore investment account located in the Cayman Islands. The money being donated by thousands of strangers is bypassing Harper entirely. We ran a deep trace on the primary holding company governing that specific offshore account. We bypassed their privacy shields to find the ultimate beneficiary." He paused, letting the heavy silence build the tension for a fraction of a second. "It belongs to Richard Sterling," confirmed, his voice ringing with absolute triumph. "Your father is not just bullying you for a signature, Valerie. He is actively utilizing his granddaughter's fake tears to illegally funnel thousands of dollars in charitable donations directly into his own failing, high-risk offshore investments. He is committing massive, verifiable wire fraud." I sat back in my leather chair, staring at the wall as the sheer magnitude of Richard's criminal arrogance washed over me. He had orchestrated this entire pathetic circus to steal money from strangers to cover his own massive financial failures. "Sterling, shut it down right now," I commanded. My voice was a blade of solid ice. "Do not give them another single hour to collect money from sympathetic victims. I want that entire account frozen, and I want Richard to know exactly who engineered his total destruction." "Consider it done," Sterling replied with vicious enthusiasm. "I am submitting the financial routing evidence directly to the Federal Trade Commission. I am also escalating a priority fraud report to the Trust and Safety Division at GoFundMe. That cash will be locked down in a matter of minutes. Furthermore, I am currently dispatching a premium process server directly to your father's estate. They will be served with a massive cease and desist order alongside formal notification of our intent to file federal wire fraud charges." I ended the call leaning back in my chair with a deep sense of satisfaction. The trap was set, and the steel jaws were about to snap shut. Miles away inside Richard's sprawling, oppressive mansion, the atmosphere was thick with manufactured grief and greedy anticipation. Harper was sitting cross-legged on her plush velvet duvet, staring intently at her laptop screen. The bright green donation counter on her fraudulent campaign had just ticked past $45,000. She grinned widely, imagining the sheer absolute envy of her high school peers when she showed up to the spring dance. In a separate browser tab, she had already loaded the checkout page for a heavily beaded custom couture prom dress. The designer gown cost $3,000, and Harper fully intended to use her newly acquired internet pity money to buy it right this second. She clicked the withdrawal button on the campaign dashboard, ready to transfer the funds. A small loading circle spun on the screen. Harper tapped her manicured fingernails against the keyboard impatiently. Suddenly, the screen flashed bright red. A bold error message appeared, stating the transaction could not be completed. The text below it indicated the account was officially frozen pending a severe fraud investigation by the platform and federal authorities. Harper's heart dropped into her stomach. She refreshed the page frantically, but the red banner remained permanently glued to the top of the screen. The total donation amount was locked. She clicked on the linked banking details, attempting to see where the error originated. That was when she noticed the routing numbers. They did not match her checking account. They did not match her mother's savings account. They matched a corporate holding entity she had never seen before. "Mom," she screamed, jumping off her bed and sprinting down the grand sweeping staircase. "Mom, get out here right now." Victoria rushed out of the formal dining room holding a crystal glass of wine. Richard followed closely behind her, his face scowling with irritation at the sudden loud disruption. Patricia was trailing them, rubbing her temples dramatically. "What is wrong with you, Harper?" Victoria snapped harshly. "Why are you screaming like a banshee?" "The money is gone," Harper shrieked, shoving her laptop directly into her mother's face. "The GoFundMe is completely frozen. It says there is a massive fraud investigation. And why the hell is the payout linked to some weird corporate account? I was trying to buy my $3,000 prom dress and the transaction was blocked." Richard snatched the laptop from her hands, his face instantly draining of all color. He stared at the red banner of doom, realizing his brilliant offshore funnel had just been completely intercepted. "What do you mean it is frozen?" Victoria demanded, her voice rising in panic. "Dad, what did you do with the account routing?" "I secured the funds," Richard roared, slamming the laptop down onto a glass side table. "I secured the money to protect this family from Valerie and her vindictive lawsuits." "You ungrateful brat," he snarled, pointing at Harper. "You do not need a $3,000 dress when I am trying to save my entire financial portfolio from collapse. Keep your mouth shut and let the adults handle the money." Harper staggered backward, her eyes wide with horrified realization. She looked at her grandfather and then turned to her mother. "You let him steal my money!" she accused, her voice shaking with genuine rage. "I sat in my room making fake crying videos, humiliating myself on the internet for millions of people, and you let him steal the cash for his own investments. You used me." "Do not speak to your grandfather that way," Victoria yelled, trying to regain control of the narrative. "He is trying to save us. Marcus left me and Valerie cut off my credit cards. We are broke, Harper. We needed that money to survive." "I do not care," Harper screamed back, tears of pure fury streaming down her face. "You are all completely toxic and insane. I am deleting the video and telling everyone you stole the donations." Before Richard could unleash another terrifying roar, the heavy brass knocker on the front door echoed through the foyer. Patricia gasped, clutching her chest in a renewed display of phantom heart pains. Victoria marched to the door and yanked it open. A man in a plain suit handed her a thick manila envelope, tipped his hat, and walked away without a word. Victoria tore open the envelope. She pulled out the heavy legal documents and read the first page. Her hands began to shake violently. "It is a cease and desist from Sterling Victoria," whispered her voice completely devoid of air. "Valerie reported the GoFundMe to the Federal Trade Commission. They have all the routing numbers, Dad. They know about the offshore accounts. Valerie is threatening to hand the evidence over to the federal prosecutors by Monday morning." The entire grand foyer erupted into absolute chaos. The alliance completely fractured. Richard started screaming about ungrateful daughters ruining his life. Patricia collapsed onto a velvet bench, weeping loudly about her ruined social reputation and her failing nerves. Harper stormed back up the stairs, slamming her bedroom door so hard the framed portraits on the wall rattled. Victoria stood in the center of the madness, gripping the legal threat in her hands. She was entirely backed into a terrifying corner. Marcus was gone. The unlimited money was gone. The fake charity funds were frozen. Now she was staring down the barrel of federal wire fraud charges. She knew Valerie would absolutely follow through on the threat. Valerie did not bluff. Victoria needed leverage immediately. She needed devastating blackmail material to force Valerie to drop the impending lawsuits and sign over the grandfather's estate. Victoria dropped the legal papers on the floor and grabbed her purse. She dug frantically through the bottom lining of her designer bag, pushing aside lipstick tubes and receipts until her fingers brushed against cold, jagged metal. She pulled out a small, old brass key. Years ago, under the guise of being an emergency family contact, Victoria had secretly copied the spare key to Valerie's private downtown luxury penthouse. She had kept it hidden, waiting for a moment exactly like this. She slipped out the front door, ignoring the sounds of her family tearing each other apart. She got into her car and sped toward the city center. She knew Valerie was currently tied up at the staging showroom finalizing contracts. The penthouse would be completely empty. Victoria parked in the visitor lot and bypassed the main building concierge by slipping quietly through the resident garage entrance. She rode the private elevator up to the top floor, her heart pounding with desperate adrenaline. She stepped out into the quiet, isolated hallway and approached Valerie's heavy oak door. She inserted the stolen brass key into the lock. It clicked smoothly. Victoria turned the handle and stepped into the silent, pristine penthouse, ready to tear the entire place apart to find the secrets she needed to survive. She stepped out into the quiet, isolated hallway and approached Valerie's heavy oak door. She inserted the stolen brass key into the lock. It clicked smoothly. Victoria turned the handle and stepped into the silent, pristine penthouse, ready to tear the entire place apart to find the secrets she needed to survive. Victoria slammed the heavy oak door shut behind her. The penthouse was a masterpiece of minimalist luxury, featuring floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the sprawling Los Angeles skyline. She completely ignored the breathtaking view and the imported Italian leather furniture. She was a woman driven entirely by the terrifying reality of impending federal charges and absolute financial ruin. She marched directly down the wide hallway, her heels clicking aggressively against the polished hardwood floors, heading straight for my private home office. She threw open the frosted glass door and began her frantic search. My office was meticulously organized, an exact reflection of my professional life. Victoria did not care. She yanked open the top drawers of my massive mahogany desk, tossing custom stationery and expensive luxury pens across the room. She was actively looking for physical client lists, printed financial ledgers, or unencrypted hard drives. She desperately needed leverage. She needed proof of a dirty business deal, a hidden offshore account, or any minor legal infraction she could twist into a blackmail scheme to force me into dropping the fraud charges against her and Richard. She pulled out the lower filing cabinets, dumping perfectly categorized manila folders onto the pristine white rug. Finding nothing but standard tax returns and boring vendor contracts, her panic violently escalated. She swept her arm across the top of my desk, sending my sleek computer monitor and a heavy crystal vase crashing to the floor. The vase shattered into 100 jagged pieces. Victoria dropped to her knees, checking beneath the desk and behind the built-in mahogany shelving units. She finally spotted the two heavy reinforced steel safes bolted directly into the concrete wall. She grabbed the handle of the first safe, yanking it with all her strength, but the biometric lock did not even budge. She pounded her fists against the cold metal, letting out a frustrated, agonizing scream. Miles away inside my downtown staging showroom, my personal cell phone illuminated with a silent, urgent red notification. I was sitting at my desk reviewing the final contract for a $15 million property when the smart home security alert flashed across my screen. I picked up the device and tapped the notification, opening my comprehensive home surveillance app. I expected to see my housekeeper arriving early or a delivery person dropping off a package at the front door. Instead, the high-definition camera, positioned discreetly in the corner of my home office, revealed a scene of absolute pathetic destruction. I watched in cold, fascinated silence as my older sister behaved like a trapped rabid animal inside my sanctuary. I zoomed in on the live feed, observing the manic sweat glistening on Victoria's forehead as she viciously kicked my filing cabinet. She looked entirely deranged. She was systematically trashing the room, ripping framed degrees off the walls and tearing through my personal bookshelves in a desperate, unhinged frenzy to find a single scrap of dirt on me. My initial instinct was to simply hit the emergency button on the app and dispatch the Los Angeles Police Department directly to the penthouse. A breaking and entering charge, combined with felony vandalism, would be the absolute perfect addition to her impending federal wire fraud indictment. But as I watched her desperately clawing at the biometric scanner on my steel safe, a much better, much more devastating strategy formed in my mind. I minimized the camera feed and opened the environmental controls for the penthouse. My entire residence was wired with a state-of-the-art military-grade security system designed to protect my most valuable assets. I tapped the icon for the home office. I bypassed the standard security protocols and manually engaged the heavy-duty electronic deadbolts. Back in the penthouse, a loud, sharp mechanical click echoed through the trashed room. On my screen, I watched Victoria freeze. Her head snapped toward the frosted glass office door. She slowly pushed herself off the floor, stepping over the shattered crystal and dumped files. She grabbed the silver door handle and pushed. It did not move. She pulled the handle, jerking it aggressively toward her chest. The reinforced door remained absolutely rock solid. Victoria slammed her shoulder against the thick wood, rattling the frame, but the electronic deadbolts held perfectly firm. She was entirely, completely trapped inside a reinforced room on the top floor of my building with absolutely no way out. Panic instantly replaced her manic rage. I watched her pull her cell phone from her pocket, only to stare in absolute horror at the screen. My office was lined with signal-blocking insulation designed to secure my confidential client meetings. She had absolutely zero cellular reception. She ran to the floor-to-ceiling window, frantically searching for a latch, but the heavy impact-resistant glass was permanently sealed shut. She was locked in a soundproof signal dead vault of her own choosing. I toggled back to the camera feed and pressed the two-way audio icon. A small green microphone illuminated on my screen. I leaned forward, resting my chin on my hand, and spoke directly into the speaker. "Are you finding everything you need, Victoria?" I asked, my voice echoing crystal clear through the hidden surround sound speakers built into my office ceiling. Victoria shrieked, spinning around wildly, looking for the source of my voice. She stared directly up at the small black camera lens mounted in the corner, her face draining of every single ounce of color. "Valerie," she gasped, her chest heaving with sheer terror. "Let me out of here right now. You cannot hold me hostage. This is kidnapping." "You broke into my secure residence using a stolen key," I corrected smoothly, my tone dripping with absolute, unshakable authority. "You are currently trespassing and committing felony vandalism. The police would call this containing a dangerous intruder until authorities arrive. I have you in glorious high definition committing multiple crimes, Victoria. I have every single angle of you destroying my property recorded and backed up to a secure remote cloud server." "Please, Valerie," she pleaded, dropping her arrogant facade instantly. Her voice broke, dissolving into pathetic, desperate sobs. "Please do not call the cops. I was just looking for a way to fix things. Dad is out of control and Marcus will not even look at me. I have nothing left. Please just open the door." I let her sit in her absolute suffocating fear for 10 agonizing seconds. I watched her tremble, surrounded by the wreckage she had caused. "I am going to unlock this door on one very specific condition," I announced, my voice slicing through her pathetic sobbing like a razor blade. "You, Patricia, Richard, and Harper are going to meet me for a formal Thanksgiving dinner this coming Friday. I have rented a private dining room and you will all be in attendance. We are going to have a beautiful mandatory family reunion. You will sit at my table and you will listen to exactly what I have to say. If you refuse, or if a single one of you skips that dinner, I will immediately forward this high-definition footage directly to Marcus and the Los Angeles Police Department. You have exactly 30 seconds to decide before I dial 911. Victoria crumbled instantly. I agree, she gasped, her chest heaving as she stared directly into the camera lens. We will be there. Just let me out. I tapped a single button on my screen. The heavy electronic deadbolts retracted with a loud mechanical clack. Victoria did not look back. She yanked the door open and fled my penthouse like a terrified ghost. Friday evening arrived with a chilling torrential downpour that perfectly matched the mood inside the exclusive private dining room I had rented at L'Hermitage. The space was a masterclass in quiet intimidation. Dark mahogany walls absorbed the dim light from the crystal chandelier overhead. A massive oak table stretched across the center set with flawless sterling silver and imported porcelain. I sat at the absolute head of the table, sipping a glass of vintage Pinot Noir, waiting for my mandatory guests to arrive. Marcus was the very first to walk through the heavy double doors. He looked immaculate in a tailored charcoal suit, but his face was completely devoid of its usual arrogant salesman charm. He did not greet me. He simply offered a curt professional nod and walked straight to the absolute farthest end of the table. He took a seat, pulling out his phone and completely ignoring the empty chairs around him. He was here strictly as an observer, eager to watch the final destruction of the family he had foolishly married into. 15 minutes later, the main event began. Richard marched into the room first, his face a mask of purple boiling rage. Patricia followed closely behind him, clutching her designer handbag like a physical shield. Victoria and Harper trailed at the rear, looking like prisoners walking directly toward the execution block. The sheer visual contrast between their usual entitled swagger and their current humiliated obedience was absolutely intoxicating. Victoria refused to make eye contact with anyone, especially Marcus, who did not even bother to look up from his phone when his wife entered the room. Harper immediately slumped into a chair, crossing her arms over her chest and pouting fiercely. She was still radiating toxic teenage fury over her frozen GoFundMe cash and the total loss of her couture prom dress. Richard glared at me, his hands balling into tight fists at his sides, but the looming threat of federal wire fraud charges kept his mouth firmly shut. He pulled out a chair for Patricia and took his own seat, staring daggers into the pristine white tablecloth. The silence in the room was dense, heavy, and incredibly suffocating. I did not offer them a menu. I did not offer them a drink. I simply sat at the head of the table, letting the agonizing quiet stretch for 5 full minutes. I watched them squirm under the crushing weight of their own monumental failures. Patricia could not handle the silence. She had spent her entire life controlling the narrative, and being forced into submission by the daughter she despised was physically painful for her. She reached for her water glass, took a slow, calculated sip, and sat up perfectly straight. She smoothed her napkin over her lap and pasted on her signature look of benevolent, long-suffering victimhood. "Valerie, this entire charade is incredibly unnecessary," Patricia announced, her voice echoing loudly in the quiet room. She attempted to project the aura of a disappointed but loving matriarch dealing with a wildly out-of-control teenager. "We are a family. We have certainly had our disagreements this week, but resorting to blackmail and threats is completely beneath us." I raised a single eyebrow, taking another slow sip of my wine. I did not say a word. I let her continue her pathetic performance. "You have caused a tremendous amount of pain," Patricia continued, her voice taking on a sickly, sweet, patronizing tone. "You humiliated your sister. You stole a vehicle from your niece. You completely disrespected your father, and you falsely accused me of financial impropriety. We came here tonight because we know you are hurting. We came here because despite your vicious behavior, you are still my daughter. We are here because you need our forgiveness, Valerie. We are willing to put this ugly legal nonsense behind us and welcome you back into the fold if you are willing to apologize and make things financially right." Richard grunted his agreement, crossing his arms over his chest. "Your mother is right," he muttered gruffly. "We can drop the lawyers and handle this internally. Just cancel the FTC report and we can move forward. The absolute staggering magnitude of their collective delusion was almost beautiful. They were completely cornered, facing federal prison and financial ruin, yet they still genuinely believed they could manipulate me with cheap guilt and fake maternal affection. They still thought I wanted their approval. I set my wine glass down. The sharp clink of crystal against the table instantly silenced the room. I looked directly at Patricia, maintaining a completely blank, emotionless expression. "I did not invite you here for a family reunion," I stated, my voice perfectly calm and completely lethal. "I invited you here to witness a very specific transaction." I raised my hand and snapped my fingers once. The heavy oak doors swung open immediately. A uniformed waiter entered the private dining room carrying a massive domed silver platter. He approached the table, his footsteps silent against the thick carpet. Harper actually perked up, clearly expecting a traditional Thanksgiving turkey or a lavish catered feast. Richard uncrossed his arms, preparing for a meal he intended to completely consume on my dime. The waiter placed the enormous silver platter directly in the center of the polished oak table right in front of me. He bowed his head respectfully and swiftly exited the room, pulling the heavy doors securely shut behind him. "You have spent your entire lives consuming everything I have ever built," I announced, standing up slowly from my chair. "You consumed my money. You consumed my business assets. You consumed my grandfather's inheritance. Tonight we are serving something completely different." I reached forward and grasped the handle of the large silver dome. I locked eyes with Richard, watching the arrogant expectation on his face slowly curdle into sudden freezing panic. I lifted the heavy silver lid completely off the platter. There was no turkey. There was no lavish holiday feast. Sitting perfectly centered on the gleaming silver tray was a massive dense stack of heavily verified certified legal documents. The top page featured a bold red Federal Trade Commission stamp. Right below it was a comprehensive list of Richard's offshore shell corporations, a printed confession detailing Victoria's felony breaking and entering, and a fully drafted irrevocable property deed transfer for every single asset my grandfather had ever owned. I placed my fingertips against the edge of the dense paper stack and pushed. The heavy packet glided smoothly down the length of the polished oak table, stopping precisely inches from Richard's plate. The room went completely still. The only sound was the faint hum of the climate control system and the ragged, shallow breathing of my older sister. Victoria stared down at her printed confession, her eyes wide and bloodshot. The high-definition security stills of her trashing my penthouse office were clipped directly to the front of her breaking and entering charge. She opened her mouth to speak, but only a pathetic wheezing sound escaped her throat. She looked utterly, completely broken, realizing her desperate break-in had delivered her directly into federal custody. Marcus leaned forward slightly in his chair at the far end of the table. He did not say a single word, but the cold, calculated look of vindication on his face was unmistakable. He picked up his crystal water glass, taking a slow sip as he watched his soon-to-be ex-wife completely unravel. He had suspected for years that her entire family was built on a foundation of toxic lies and financial smoke, but seeing the absolute verifiable proof laid out on a silver platter was deeply satisfying to him. He was thoroughly enjoying the front-row seat to their ultimate destruction. Richard did not look at Victoria. His eyes were entirely locked on the red Federal Trade Commission stamp glaring back at him from the top of the stack. His face had transitioned from a boiling, furious purple to a sickly, terrifying shade of gray. The physical manifestation of his utter defeat was staggering. He had spent decades projecting the image of an untouchable, wealthy titan of industry. He ruled our family with an iron fist, demanding absolute obedience and crushing anyone who dared to question his supreme authority. Now he was physically shrinking into his expensive tailored suit, entirely paralyzed by the reality of his massive, impending federal wire fraud indictment. The GoFundMe scheme he had orchestrated with his granddaughter had triggered a lethal federal investigation into his entire life. Harper sat rigidly beside her mother, staring at the documents with an expression of pure, unadulterated horror. The reality that her grandfather had actively manipulated her using her fake digital tears to funnel money into his own illegal offshore accounts was finally cementing in her teenage brain. The funds for her couture prom dress were permanently frozen, and the police were actively investigating her direct involvement in a massive crowdfunding scam. She aggressively pushed her chair back from the table, crossing her arms and shooting daggers at Richard. Patricia, however, was completely oblivious to the legal gravity of the document sitting in front of her husband. She had spent a lifetime willfully ignoring reality in favor of country club aesthetics, and she was not about to stop now. She scoffed loudly, adjusting her expensive pearl necklace and glaring at me with absolute venomous disdain. "This is your grand plan, Valerie," she sneered, her voice dripping with artificial superiority. "You force us into a private dining room under the threat of calling the police just to shove fabricated paperwork in our faces. Your father is a highly respected real estate mogul. He does not have offshore shell corporations. He does not commit fraud. We live in a pristine six-bedroom estate in the most exclusive neighborhood in this entire city. We host corporate executives every single weekend. You are just a jealous, bitter staging coordinator trying to tear down a legacy you could never achieve. You need serious psychiatric help." I maintained steady, unblinking eye contact with my mother. I allowed a slow, cold smile to form on my lips, taking the time to savor the absolute peak of her towering arrogance before completely dismantling it. "You are absolutely right, Patricia," I stated, my voice perfectly calm and completely lethal. "You do live in a pristine six-bedroom estate. You do host lavish parties for executives who drink imported champagne on your manicured back lawn while you look down on everyone around you. But you are entirely wrong about who actually owns that legacy." I stood up from my chair at the head of the table, walking slowly, deliberately down the length of the room. I stopped directly behind Richard's chair, resting my hands lightly on the mahogany backrest. He flinched violently at my proximity, a fine layer of sweat breaking out across his forehead, but he did not dare turn around. "4 years ago, your respected real estate mogul husband made a series of incredibly catastrophic investments," I explained, projecting my voice so every single person in the room could hear the absolute truth. "He leveraged your beloved family estate to the absolute maximum limit to fund high-risk overseas ventures. When those investments completely crashed, the bank immediately initiated aggressive foreclosure proceedings." Patricia let out a sharp, indignant gasp, shaking her head in fierce denial, but I did not stop speaking. Richard was absolutely terrified of the public humiliation. I continued pacing slowly toward the opposite side of the table. He knew that a public foreclosure would instantly destroy his elite country club status and completely obliterate his professional reputation. So he panicked. He quietly and desperately brokered a deal entirely behind your back. He sold the massive toxic debt to an anonymous private equity group. He completely signed away the deed to your beautiful house in exchange for a secretive leaseback agreement. He effectively sold the property from right under your feet, hoping he could temporarily rent it and eventually buy it back once his illegal offshore bets finally paid off. Harper let out a harsh, bitter laugh, throwing her hands up in the air. "So we are actually completely broke," she announced, her voice echoing through the silent room. "You dragged me into federal wire fraud because you literally lost our house." Victoria buried her face in her hands, completely unable to look at her husband or her daughter. "But those illegal offshore bets never paid off, did they?" "Richard," I asked, my tone dropping to a dangerous, unyielding whisper, "you kept losing money. You kept sinking deeper and deeper into a financial black hole. And that anonymous private equity group holding the deed to your magnificent estate simply sat back and watched you drown. You were so desperate to maintain your illusion of wealth that you never once bothered to look into the corporate structure of that holding company. If you had hired a decent attorney to run a basic background check, you would have noticed a very familiar name listed as the primary managing director." I walked back to my seat at the head of the table and sat down, resting my hands flat on the polished oak surface. I locked eyes with Patricia, watching her arrogant facade finally shatter into a million irreparable pieces. "I am your landlord," I stated coldly, letting the absolute finality of the statement ring through the silent room. and you haven't paid rent in 48 months. Patricia slammed her hands flat against the table, pushing herself up from her chair with terrifying, frantic energy. That is a lie, she screamed, her voice cracking wildly against the dark mahogany walls. That is an absolute vicious fabrication. Richard, tell her she is lying right now. Tell her this is just another one of her psychotic jealousy stunts. Tell me we own our home. Patricia looked desperately at her husband, practically begging him to rise up and defend their pristine, wealthy image. Richard simply buried his face in his hands, letting out a long, broken, defeated groan. He did not say a single word. He did not look at her. His absolute, crushing silence confirmed every single terrifying word I had just spoken. Patricia stood frozen, her chest heaving as the catastrophic reality of her total financial ruin and impending homelessness finally destroyed her perfect delusional world. I reached across the table and lifted the heavy silver dome one final time. I pulled out a single crisp piece of heavy parchment paper. I slid it firmly across the polished wood, watching it stop perfectly straight right next to her trembling hands. It was a formal, legally certified 30-day eviction notice. Richard lunged across the pristine white tablecloth, his hands clawing desperately for the certified 30-day eviction notice. The expensive, heavy sterling silverware clattered violently against the porcelain plates, sending a half-full wineglass crashing into the center of the table. His eyes were wide, wild, and entirely bloodshot. The absolute terrifying prospect of losing the towering white pillar facade he had built his entire life upon had snapped what little mental restraint he had left. He was a cornered, desperate predator, willing to rip the physical legal paper to shreds just to pretend his life was not a complete lie. Before his fingers could even graze the edge of the parchment, a heavy, solid shadow intercepted him. Marcus stood up from his chair at the far end of the table with precise, explosive speed. He crossed the short distance between them and physically shoved Richard back into his seat. His hand gripped Richard's expensive, tailored shoulder, slamming him hard against the dark mahogany backrest. Richard wheezed from the sudden impact, blinking up at Marcus in absolute stunned shock. Marcus did not flinch. His jaw was set rigidly, his tall, athletic frame completely blocking Richard from moving anywhere near me. It was the first time all evening he had abandoned his silent professional observer role, and his physical intervention was an absolute wall of defense. "Get your hands off the documents," Richard Marcus commanded, his voice dropping into a deep, booming registry that vibrated through the private dining room walls. "You are completely finished. Do not make yourself look any more pathetic than you already do." Marcus looked down at the older man with a level of pure, unadulterated disgust that cut sharper than any razor blade. For 2 long years, he had been forced to sit through country club dinners, listening to Richard boast about his superior financial intellect and real estate prowess, while looking down on my career as a simple staging assistant. Now the grand illusion was dead. The multi-millionaire patriarch was revealed to be nothing more than a broke, fraudulent criminal, facing a cold, concrete federal cell and an immediate eviction from his own home. Victoria let out a sharp, hysterical shriek of panic, pushing herself off her chair. She stepped over the shattered crystal on the floor, her heels sliding in the spilled red wine, as she rushed directly to Marcus's side. Tears were streaming violently down her face, ruining her expensive waterproof mascara, leaving black track marks down her pale cheeks. She grabbed his arm tightly, her perfectly manicured fingers digging into the fabric of his charcoal jacket with a terrifying, suffocating grip. "It is fine, baby." Victoria sobbed dramatically, her voice rising to a high-pitched manic register that filled the entire room. "Let them have the papers. Let them take the estate. We do not need Valerie, and we certainly do not need her pathetic holding companies. We still have our beautiful 6-bedroom house in Beverly Hills. The deed is solely in my name, Marcus. We can move there tomorrow morning and leave this entire toxic mess behind us. We do not need her forgiveness, and we do not need this house. Come home with me, baby, please." She tugged his arm desperately, trying to pull him away from the table, trying to force him back into her preferred narrative, where they were still the elite, powerful power couple of Los Angeles. She was completely unraveling, clutching onto him like a lifeline in a storm. Marcus stood entirely frozen under her touch. He did not turn to look at her. He did not offer a single ounce of comfort. Slowly, methodically, he looked down at her hands on his sleeve. The sheer, icy coldness radiating from his posture was absolute. He raised his right hand, gripped her wrists, and forcefully yanked her fingers off his arm, shaking her off him as if she were a piece of stray lint. Victoria staggered backward, her breath catching in her throat as she stared at him in utter disbelief. "Do not touch me, Victoria." Marcus said, his tone perfectly level, completely flat and entirely dead. "What are you doing?" she whispered, her voice trembling violently as she clutched her purse to her chest. "I am your wife. We are supposed to face this together." Marcus let out a short, hollow laugh that held zero amusement. He reached into the interior pocket of his charcoal suit jacket and pulled out a sleek, dark leather document folder. He did not slide it. He nosed it directly onto the table right on top of my eviction notice. "There is no Beverly Hills house," Victoria Marcus announced, dropping the absolute first hammer blow that would shatter her entire reality. "Because there is no money left in your accounts. You spent the last 4 months bragging to your friends about the $500,000 renovation you were doing on that property, but you never once checked the actual wire transfers. Your father did not just leverage the main estate, he completely drained the secondary trust accounts to cover his failing offshore investments in Panama. He signed the Beverly Hills property over as additional collateral to a private lender 3 months ago." Victoria froze, her face draining of every single ounce of color until she looked like a corpse under the chandelier light. "No," she gasped, shaking her head wildly. "That is impossible. Dad promised me that house was completely safe. He said the trust was ironclad. He lied to you just like he lied to your mother, and just like he tried to lie to the federal investigators," Marcus stated coolly, turning his gaze directly to Richard, who was now staring blankly at the floor. The private lender who took the collateral on the Beverly Hills house realized the debt was completely toxic. They did what any smart institution does when they are holding bad paper. They put it up for private auction to cut their losses immediately. Marcus turned his head slowly, looking directly at me with a profound look of respect that made Patricia let out a low, horrified groan from her seat. "I was the listing agent representing that private auction." Victoria Marcus continued, his voice slicing through the silence like a scalpel. "And 3 weeks ago, an anonymous holding entity stepped in and bought the entire Beverly Hills deed for pennies on the dollar. The corporate registration for that specific buyer was finalized just yesterday morning." Victoria stared at him, her lips trembling as she tried to connect the dots. "Who bought it, Marcus?" she pleaded desperately. "Who has our house?" Marcus stepped back, gesturing toward my end of the oak table with a cold, sweeping motion of his hand. "Your sister did," Marcus said, dropping the final, devastating bomb that completely shattered Victoria's entire world. "Valerie owns the main estate, and Valerie owns your Beverly Hills house. You do not have a single asset left to your name, Victoria. You are entirely penniless, and as of right now, I am officially filing for divorce." Victoria let out a sound that was less of a cry and more of a strangled, breathless gasp. She physically recoiled from Marcus, stumbling backward until her spine hit the heavy mahogany wall of the private dining room. The word divorce hung in the chilled air, completely paralyzing her. She looked wildly between Marcus and the stack of certified documents sitting on the silver platter, her mind completely unable to process the absolute magnitude of her sudden, total ruin. "You cannot do this!" She choked out, her hands gripping the edges of a nearby chair to keep her legs from giving out entirely. "You cannot just leave me, Marcus. We are partners. How could you let them take our house? How could you possibly lose the deed to our home?" "I did not lose the deed!" Victoria Marcus roared, his voice erupting with a sudden violent fury that made both Patricia and Richard flinch in their seats. "You lost the deed. You lost everything. You lied to me from the very first day we met." Marcus stepped aggressively toward her, his polished facade completely dropping to reveal the raw, bitter resentment boiling underneath. "3 months ago, I secured the largest commercial real estate acquisition of my entire career." He stated, his words sharp and deliberate. "It was a massive deal, Victoria. I needed aggressive, immediate liquidity to close the transaction. I leveraged our Beverly Hills home to the absolute maximum limit, using it as collateral for a short-term bridge loan. I only took that massive risk because you explicitly promised me we had a safety net. For an entire decade, you paraded around Los Angeles, telling me, telling our friends, telling my business partners that you had an untouchable 8-figure trust fund waiting for you. You swore your parents were titans of industry who could instantly cover any temporary market dip. Victoria swallowed hard, her eyes darting nervously around the room. I did have a trust, she stammered weakly. Dad said the accounts were just temporarily restricted. Shut up, Marcus snapped, cutting her off completely. Just shut your mouth and listen to reality for once in your pathetic life. When the commercial market took a sudden dip, the bank immediately called the loan. I went to tap into this glorious, legendary trust fund of yours to satisfy the margin call. Do you know what I found, Victoria? Do you know what your financial manager told me when I demanded to see the asset ledger? Marcus let out a harsh, dry laugh, running a hand over his face. Nothing, he practically spat the word. He laughed directly in my face. He told me your so-called trust fund was completely fictitious. It was empty. It never existed. It was nothing but a cheap financial mirage your father created on paper to make you look like a wealthy heiress for country club cocktail parties. You are a fraud, Victoria. You have always been a fraud. The entire room fell into a suffocating dead silence. Even Richard refused to look up, staring intensely at his pristine white napkin as his daughter was utterly humiliated. Because you lied to me about your assets for a full decade, the bank realized I had zero collateral backing. Marcus continued stepping even closer to her until she was entirely cornered. The bank instantly panicked. They called the entire commercial loan. When I could not produce the cash, they immediately seized the Beverly Hills deed and auctioned it off to the highest bidder to cover my debts. You want to know why we are financially ruined? You want to know why Valerie is sitting there holding the deed to your house? It is entirely because of you. You played the role of a fake billionaire heiress for 10 years, and your own lies finally bankrupted us. I sat quietly at the head of the table sipping my wine and watching the masterful implosion. It was a flawless execution. Marcus had brilliantly shifted the entirety of his own reckless financial gambling directly onto Victoria's shoulders. He was legally tying her fake wealth to his catastrophic failure, effectively leaving her with nothing but the blame. But we can fix it, Victoria pleaded frantically, grabbing at his lapels. Marcus, please. We can declare bankruptcy. We can start over. I will get a job. We can figure this out. I am not figuring anything out with you, he replied, his voice turning dangerously soft. I am liquidating whatever fractions of my accounts are left, and I am leaving. I am not going down with a family of broke, delusional criminals. You are on your own. No, Harper screamed. The sudden piercing sound of my niece's voice shattered the heavy tension in the dining room. Harper had been sitting perfectly still for the last 10 minutes, absorbing every single word of the conversation. Her wide eyes were fixed on her mother, and the sheer, unadulterated venom radiating from the teenager was genuinely terrifying. Harper pushed her chair back so forcefully it tipped over and crashed onto the thick carpet. She marched directly up to Victoria, her face twisted in a mask of vicious teenage rage. Are you actually telling me we are poor? Harper demanded, her voice cracking with hysterical disbelief. Are you telling me I do not have a trust fund either? All those times you promised me I would never have to work a day in my life, all the times you bragged to my friends' moms about my inheritance, it was all a complete lie. Harper, sweetheart. Please calm down, Victoria begged, reaching out to touch her daughter's arm. We will be fine. Mommy will fix this. Do not touch me, Harper shrieked, slapping Victoria's hand away with startling violence. You cannot fix anything. You are completely broke. You lost my car, you lost my prom dress, and now you are telling me I do not even have a house to go back to. My entire life is ruined because you are a pathetic liar. Watch your mouth, Victoria snapped, suddenly defensive, her maternal authority instinctively trying to flare up despite the catastrophic circumstances. I am still your mother, Harper. You will not speak to me this way in front of everyone. I will speak to you however I want, Harper snarled, stepping right into her mother's personal space. You are a joke. You have spent my entire life pretending we were better than everyone else, making me act like royalty when you knew we had absolutely nothing. You are a fake. You are poor. And now Dad is leaving you just like he should have done months ago. That is enough, Marcus commanded, stepping forward to intervene. Harper, go wait in the car. We are leaving. No, Harper yelled, spinning around to face her father, her eyes flashing with a desperate, chaotic need to cause maximum damage. She looked back at her mother, a cruel, twisted smile forming on her lips. She wanted to hurt Victoria. She wanted to physically and emotionally destroy her mother for ripping away her luxurious, entitled future. You think Dad leaving you right now is a surprise? Harper laughed, a cold, bitter sound that echoed off the dark mahogany walls. Dad is going to leave you anyway when he finds out about the hotel rooms you booked with your personal trainer. The air in the room instantly froze. Marcus stopped completely dead in his tracks. He slowly turned his head, his gaze locking onto his daughter. His face was entirely devoid of expression, but the sudden dangerous stillness in his posture was suffocating. What did you just say? Marcus asked, his voice barely a whisper, but it carried the lethal weight of an absolute death sentence. Victoria let out a strangled, horrified gasp, completely covering her mouth with both hands. Her eyes bulged in pure terror as she looked at her teenage daughter. Harper crossed her arms over her chest, lifting her chin defiantly. She looked directly at her father, refusing to back down. I said you should ask Mom why she spends 3 days a week at the Four Seasons downtown. Harper stated loudly, making absolutely certain every single person in the room heard the lethal accusation. I saw the text messages on her iPad last month, Dad. She is sleeping with Julian. She has been paying for his private hotel suites with your credit cards for 6 months. The air in the private dining room instantly froze into solid ice. The silence that followed Harper's explosive revelation was so profound it physically ached. No one moved. No one breathed. Marcus stood entirely perfectly still. The lethal accusation echoed off the dark mahogany walls, sinking deep into the marrow of his bones. His eyes remained locked on his daughter for a long, terrible moment before slowly mechanically turning toward his wife. Victoria looked like a trapped animal. Her mouth was opening and closing, but no sound came out. The sheer terror radiating from her trembling frame was absolute confirmation. Inside Marcus' mind, the puzzle pieces snapped violently together. The memory hit him like a freight train. Just days ago, Valerie had thrown a stack of credit card statements onto the floor of his showroom. He had seen the highlighted lines, the recurring massive charges at the Four Seasons, the expensive room service bills, the boutique hotel suites booked in the middle of the afternoon. At the time, he had brushed them off as Victoria's usual frivolous spa days or excessive shopping trips. Now the devastating truth crystallized. She was not just bankrupting him to keep up appearances. She was actively using his money, his credit cards, to fund her illicit affair with her personal trainer. Marcus. Victoria finally choked out, stepping toward him with her hands raised in a desperate, pleading gesture. Marcus, please listen to me. Harper is just a confused, angry teenager. She is making things up because she is upset about the house. You know she lies. Harper let out a vicious scoff, crossing her arms tighter. Tell him about the text Julian sent you yesterday, Mom. Harper fired back, completely ruthless. Tell him how Julian said he loved your new lingerie. Victoria spun around, her face contorted with sheer panic. Shut your mouth, you ungrateful little brat! Victoria shrieked, her voice cracking with hysteria. Then she turned back to Marcus, tears streaming down her face, ruining the last remnants of her perfect makeup. She dropped to her knees right there on the thick carpet, clutching at the fabric of his trousers. It meant nothing, Marcus, she sobbed, her voice dissolving into a pathetic, manic wail. It was a mistake. I was just so incredibly stressed. The financial pressure was destroying me. And Valerie has been torturing us. She made me do it. Valerie has been plotting against this family for years, making me so completely depressed and isolated that I just needed an outlet. I needed someone to make me feel safe. It is her fault, Marcus. Valerie ruined my life and drove me to it. The sheer absolute audacity of blaming me for her infidelity was breathtaking. I sat back in my chair watching the performance with cold fascination. Marcus did not yell. He did not scream or throw anything. He did not even look angry anymore. The fiery rage that had erupted when he discovered his financial ruin was completely gone, replaced by an icy, dead calm that was infinitely more terrifying. He looked down at the woman sobbing at his feet, as if he were looking at a stranger. He reached down and gently pried her fingers off his suit pants. He took a deliberate step backward, putting physical distance between them. "You are a truly repulsive human being," Victoria Marcus stated, his voice completely flat, devoid of any emotion whatsoever. He reached up and methodically straightened his charcoal tie, adjusting the knot with precise, steady hands. He smoothed the lapels of his jacket, restoring his immaculate professional armor. Then he turned his head and looked directly down the length of the long oak table at me. For years he had dismissed my warnings. He had looked down on me, siding with the arrogant, wealthy illusion my family projected. Now, standing in the wreckage of his own life, he offered me a single slow, apologetic nod. It was a silent admission of complete defeat, and an acknowledgement that I had been absolutely right about them all along. "My lawyer will have the divorce papers drafted by tomorrow morning," Marcus announced, addressing Victoria without even looking back at her. "He will officially serve them to you by Monday. Do not ever attempt to contact me again." He turned on his heel and walked toward the heavy oak double doors. He did not look back. He did not hesitate. He simply pushed the doors open and walked out of the restaurant, abandoning his fraudulent wife and his ruined in-laws to their fate. "No!" Victoria screamed, a raw, agonizing sound that tore through her throat. "Marcus, come back!" She scrambled to her feet, attempting to run after him, but her high heels caught on the edge of the carpet. She collapsed hard onto the floor, weeping hysterically into her hands. Harper simply rolled her eyes, grabbing her phone and walking out the door right behind her father, entirely indifferent to her mother's total breakdown. The dining room was a scene of absolute pathetic destruction. Victoria was sobbing on the floor. Richard was staring blankly at the 30-day eviction notice, his spirit completely broken. And then there was Patricia. Patricia, who had just watched her daughter get publicly dumped, her granddaughter walk out, and her husband completely exposed as a massive fraud. She sat at the table, taking a slow, deep breath, attempting to desperately reassemble her shattered matriarchal authority. She adjusted her posture, smoothing her perfectly styled hair. "Valerie," Patricia commanded, her voice trembling, but laced with that familiar toxic entitlement. "This has gone on entirely long enough. You have made your point. You have humiliated us and you have caused a terrible scene. Now you are going to fix this." I stared at her, completely stunned by her unyielding delusion. "You are going to transfer the deed of the main estate back into your father's name immediately," Patricia demanded, pointing a manicured finger at me. "You are going to pay off whatever remaining debt Marcus is whining about, and you are going to handle Victoria's divorce settlement. We are your family. We raised you. You have billions of dollars in assets now, and it is your absolute duty to take care of us. I expect a wire transfer by Monday morning to resolve this ugly mess." I did not say a word. I reached forward and wrapped my fingers around the stem of my crystal wine glass. I slowly lifted the vintage Pinot Noir to my lips, maintaining direct, unblinking eye contact with my mother. I took a slow, deliberate sip, perfectly mirroring the exact condescending action she had used against me at the beginning of this miserable dinner. I set the glass down with a sharp, definitive clink. "I do not owe you a single dime," I stated, my voice echoing coldly in the grand room. "You threw me away when I had nothing. Now you have nothing. Enjoy the streets, Patricia." I stood up from the head of the table, grabbing my clutch. I turned my back on the weeping Victoria, the delusional Patricia, and the broken Richard. I began walking toward the exit, leaving the legal documents and the eviction notice sitting in the center of the table. As my hand grasped the brass handle of the dining room door, Richard finally snapped out of his catatonic shock. He surged up from his chair, his face twisting into a mask of pure, desperate malice. "You think you have won, Valerie?" Richard screamed, his voice booming violently through the room, a ragged sound of a dying king making his final stand. "You think taking the house means you are untouchable. I know exactly how you secured that initial holding company funding. I know the illegal backdoor deal you made with the zoning commissioner 5 years ago. You turn your back on us now, and I swear to God I will hand the federal investigators the exact paperwork they need to put you in a cell right next to me. I paused with my hand resting on the cool brass handle of the dining room door. I did not turn around immediately. I let the silence stretch, letting his desperate venom hang in the air before slowly looking over my shoulder. Richard was breathing heavily, his chest heaving under his ruined, tailored suit. His face was a mask of pure, vindictive hatred. You think you can just walk away from this family without consequences? Valerie. Richard snarled, taking a step toward me but keeping a cautious distance. I know every single major player in the commercial and residential real estate market in this city. I built those networks while you were still playing with fabric swatches. I will call every developer, every broker, and every private equity firm in the state. I will use my old industry connections to completely blacklist your pathetic staging company. I will spread the word that your business is a front, that your assets are stolen, and that you are under federal investigation. He leaned forward, resting his knuckles on the table, his eyes burning with a manic fire. I will systematically destroy your professional reputation. I will make sure you lose every single contract you have ever signed. I will drag you down until you are exactly as broke and destitute as we are. You will be begging me for a job when I am done with you. I looked at the man who had tormented me for my entire life. I did not feel a single ounce of fear. Instead, a slow, genuine smile spread across my face. It was the smile of a woman who knew she held all the cards in a game her opponent did not even realize was already over. You do not have any connections left, Richard, I replied, my voice echoing with absolute finality. Your phone calls are going to go straight to voicemail because nobody in this city wants to associate with a toxic radioactive fraud. Make all the threats you want. You are screaming into a void. I turned the brass handle, pushed the heavy oak doors open, and walked out into the cool evening air. I left the restaurant without a single backward glance, stepping into my waiting car and leaving the shattered remnants of my family to drown in the absolute ruin they had built for themselves. The weekend passed in a state of profound, serene quiet. For the first time in 35 years, the heavy, suffocating weight of my family's expectations and criticisms was completely gone. I spent Sunday morning at my penthouse drinking coffee on the balcony and watching the city wake up, knowing that I officially owned the very real estate empire my father had falsely claimed as his own. But a cornered animal is always the most dangerous right before it is put down. Monday morning arrived with a sharp jolt of reality. I was sitting at the sleek glass desk in my downtown office reviewing the logistics for a massive upcoming luxury high-rise staging project when my private office line rang. The caller ID flashed the name of my largest, most lucrative client, Pinnacle Luxury Developments. They were the crown jewel of my portfolio, responsible for over 40% of my annual staging revenue. I picked up the receiver, expecting a routine check in regarding our upcoming installation schedule. Valerie, we have a massive problem. The voice of David, the senior project manager, sounded incredibly tense, tight with a level of anxiety I had never heard from him before. I need you down at our corporate headquarters right now, in the main boardroom. David, what is going on? I asked, sitting up straight and pulling a fresh legal pad toward me. Your father has been calling our executive suite non-stop since Saturday morning, David explained, his voice dropping to a harsh whisper. He has left over 24 unhinged voicemails on our managing director's private line. He is claiming that your staging company is entirely insolvent. He is telling our board that your inventory is currently seized by federal investigators as part of a massive wire fraud indictment, and that any developer doing business with you will be subpoenaed as an accessory to money laundering. I closed my eyes, taking a slow, deep breath. Richard was actually trying to execute his pathetic threat. He was throwing a desperate, chaotic tantrum, trying to drag my legitimate business into his entirely real federal nightmare. David, you and I both know my company is completely clean, I stated firmly, keeping my tone professional and unshaken. My father is facing his own personal legal crisis, and he is lashing out. I can provide full financial transparency and legal affidavits within the hour. I know, Valerie, but the board is completely spooked, David interrupted, sounding genuinely apologetic but entirely unyielding. You know how protective they are of the Pinnacle brand. The mere mention of a federal wire fraud investigation is radioactive. The executive committee called an emergency meeting. They are threatening to void your master contract and pull you off the downtown high-rise project immediately. You need to get down here and defend your business right now before they officially terminate our partnership. I am on my way, I said, hanging up the phone. I did not panic. I methodically gathered my tablet, my certified bank statements, and a printed copy of the public federal indictment records bearing Richard's name. I was going to walk into that boardroom and completely dismantle my father's lies with cold, hard, verifiable facts. I was not going to let a desperate broke criminal destroy the staging empire I had bled to build. The drive to the Pinnacle corporate headquarters took less than 20 minutes. The towering glass skyscraper loomed over the downtown district, a monument to serious wealth and untouchable power. I rode the private elevator up to the executive penthouse floor, my heels clicking sharply against the polished marble as I approached the massive frosted glass doors of the main boardroom. I squared my shoulders, lifting my chin and preparing to face a firing squad of anxious conservative real estate executives. I pushed the heavy glass doors open, stepping into the expansive sunlit room, ready to fight for my professional life. The boardroom was entirely empty. There was no firing squad. There was no anxious executive committee. There was no David clutching a clipboard of voided contracts. The long, highly polished granite conference table stretched across the room, reflecting the panoramic views of the city skyline. There was only one person in the room. Sitting directly at the head of the table, lounging back in a plush leather executive chair, was Marcus. He was wearing a sharp, tailored navy suit, his hands resting casually on the granite surface. He watched me walk into the room with a calm, calculating expression that was entirely unreadable. The silence in the high-rise boardroom was absolute. My mind raced frantically, trying to process why my sister's soon-to-be ex-husband was sitting in the executive chair of my largest luxury developer client. "Hello, Valerie," Marcus said, his deep voice carrying effortlessly across the empty room. "Please take a seat. We have a lot of business to discuss." I pulled out the heavy leather chair opposite him and sat down, resting my hands flat on the cold, polished granite. I maintained absolute neutral eye contact, refusing to let my internal shock show on my face. I had known Marcus was a successful commercial real estate investor, but I had never bothered to dig into his specific corporate affiliations. My family had always painted him as an independent lone wolf, making his fortune in the shadows. Finding him sitting at the absolute apex of Pinnacle luxury developments completely recontextualized everything I knew about him. "You are the lead broker for Pinnacle," I stated. It was not a question. Marcus gave a single sharp affirmative nod. "I handle every major commercial acquisition and luxury residential portfolio for this entire firm, Valerie. I direct the acquisitions, I manage the development funding, and I hold a permanent seat on the executive board." He leaned forward, resting his forearms on the table. The icy, detached demeanor he had carried during the explosive family dinner was completely gone. Here, in his own territory, he radiated absolute lethal authority. "David told me the board was ready to pull my contracts," I said, keeping my voice perfectly level. "He said my father had threatened to involve federal investigators and ruin my staging business." Marcus let out a low, humorless laugh that echoed off the high-rise glass windows. "David is a project manager. He only knows what the panicked junior executives tell him." Yes, the board was initially spooked when the calls started coming in. Your father did not just call the managing director. He somehow bypassed the entire corporate switchboard and dialed the personal cell phones of 4 different board members. He spent his entire weekend making wild, frantic threats. He claimed your staging inventory was purchased with stolen offshore funds. He claimed you were the mastermind behind his own tax evasion scheme. He even threatened to alert the media that Pinnacle was actively colluding with a federal criminal if we did not immediately sever all ties with your company. I felt a cold flash of anger tighten my jaw. Richard was truly willing to burn my entire life to the ground just to validate his own miserable ego. "I brought certified financials," I replied, reaching for my leather bag. I have sworn legal affidavits and the public indictment records showing his guilt. I can prove my business is entirely clean. You do not need to prove anything to me, Marcus said, holding up a hand to stop me. I intercepted the issue before the executive committee even had a chance to formally convene. Your father thought he was being a ruthless shark executing a brilliant corporate sabotage. He completely forgot that corporate executive phone lines are legally recorded. Marcus reached out and tapped a button on the sleek digital console embedded in the granite table. I played the audio files of his 27 unhinged voicemails directly to the board of directors this morning. Marcus explained, his voice dripping with clinical disgust. They did not hear a concerned whistleblower uncovering corporate fraud. They heard a desperate, cornered, bankrupt criminal having a complete psychological breakdown. They heard the sheer panic in his voice. I presented the board with his current foreclosure status, his frozen assets, and his impending federal indictment. I proved to them beyond a shadow of a doubt that Richard was not blowing the whistle on you. He was attempting blatant corporate extortion. I sat back in my chair, letting the absolute relief wash over me. Richard had fired his best and final shot, and it had harmlessly ricocheted off a wall of ironclad corporate security. He had effectively blacklisted himself from ever stepping foot in this building or any other major firm in the city. The board completely dismissed his claims, Marcus continued, but his pathetic little stunt did force us to take a much closer look at your corporate profile, Valerie. I spent the last 48 hours auditing your staging portfolio. I looked at your profit margins, your inventory acquisitions, and your turnaround times. Marcus reached into his suit jacket and pulled out a thick, professionally bound document. He slid it firmly across the long granite table. It stopped precisely in front of my hands. Pinnacle is breaking ground on 3 new luxury high-rise developments next quarter, Marcus stated, his eyes locked onto mine. We are also acquiring a massive portfolio of 52 ultra-luxury coastal properties. We were originally planning to split the staging contracts between 3 different national firms. After reviewing your numbers, I told the board that was a mistake. We do not need 3 separate firms. We just need you. I looked down at the document. It was not a termination letter. It was an exclusive master vendor agreement. The numbers printed on the first page were absolutely staggering. It was a multi-million-dollar contract that would instantly quadruple the net worth of my staging company. It would permanently elevate me from a successful local business owner to an untouchable national industry titan. For 2 years, I sat at that miserable dining room table and watched your father treat you like dirt. Marcus said, his voice softening just a fraction, but remaining completely serious. I watched Victoria mock your clothes and Harper roll her eyes at your career. I watched your mother treat you like an embarrassment, and the entire time you were sitting there quietly building a completely legitimate, highly profitable empire right under their noses while they drowned in their own toxic fake wealth. Marcus stood up from his chair, walking around the side of the massive table. He extended his right hand toward me. I have zero tolerance for frauds and liars, Marcus stated, looking me dead in the eye. But I respect people who build their own empires from the ground up. Let us do business, Valerie. I stood up, meeting his intense gaze. I reached out and firmly grasped his hand. It was not just a corporate agreement. It was a powerful alliance forged in the ashes of Richard's and Victoria's absolute destruction. We had both survived the toxic fallout of their lies, and now we were stepping over their ruins to build something real and lasting. We have a deal, Marcus, I said, giving his hand a firm, confident shake. Before he could reply, the sleek digital intercom on the center of the conference table chimed sharply. A flashing red light illuminated the dark room. Marcus frowned, releasing my hand and pressing the speaker button. Yes, Sarah, what is it? Marcus asked. Mr. Sterling, I am so sorry to interrupt your meeting, the receptionist said, her voice trembling with barely contained panic. We have a severe situation in the main lobby. Security is requesting your immediate authorization to involve local law enforcement. What is the issue? Marcus demanded, his tone instantly shifting back to cold corporate authority. There is an older couple down here causing a massive disturbance, the receptionist explained, her breath catching slightly. They bypassed the exterior security gate by tailgating a delivery truck. They are screaming at the front desk, refusing to leave the premises. The man says his name is Richard, and the woman says she is Patricia. They are demanding to see you immediately. They are loudly claiming to the entire lobby that you owe them a bailout loan to save their estate, and they are threatening to completely destroy the reception area if you do not come down right now with a check. Marcus kept his finger pressed firmly on the intercom button, his eyes locked on mine. The flashing red light illuminated the sharp angles of his face. "Tell security to stand down." "Sarah," Marcus commanded, his voice completely devoid of panic. "Do not call the police. I will handle this personally." He released the button and the boardroom fell back into a heavy silence. He looked at the multi-million-dollar contract resting in my hands and then gave a slow, deliberate nod. "It seems your family is entirely out of moves, Valerie. Shall we go down and put them out of their misery?" I stood up, sliding the heavy contract folder into my leather tote bag. "Led the way," I replied. We walked out of the boardroom and stepped into the private executive elevator. The doors glided shut, sealing us in the polished mahogany and mirrored glass carriage. As we descended 70 floors toward the lobby, neither of us spoke a word. We did not need to. The quiet hum of the elevator was the sound of an absolute shift in power. For decades, my parents had controlled the narrative. They had dictated who was successful and who was a failure. Now they were causing a hysterical scene in the lobby of a building where Marcus held the keys, and I had just secured the crown jewel. The elevator chimed softly as we reached the ground floor. The silver doors parted, revealing the sprawling, immaculate expanse of the Pinnacle corporate lobby. It was a cathedral of white marble, towering water features, and severe modern art. And right in the center of it, completely ruining the pristine corporate atmosphere, were Richard and Patricia. They looked absolutely unrecognizable. The polished, arrogant veneer they had maintained my entire life was completely shattered. Richard's custom suit was hopelessly wrinkled, his tie was missing, and his face was gray with exhaustion and terror. Patricia looked even worse. Her signature perfect blowout was a frayed mess. Her mascara was smeared down her cheeks, leaving dark streaks across her pale skin. They were frantically arguing with two large stone-faced security guards who were actively trying to herd them toward the revolving glass exit doors. Employees and visiting executives were pausing in the lobby, openly staring at the pathetic spectacle. It was a total public humiliation. Marcus stepped out of the elevator first, with me right beside him. The sharp echo of his footsteps against the marble floor caught Richard's attention. Richard spun around, his wild eyes locking onto his son-in-law. He shoved past the security guard, surging forward with a manic, desperate energy. "Marcus, thank God you came down!" Richard practically screamed, his voice cracking with hysteria. "You have to listen to me. The banks have completely frozen our accounts. They are seizing the corporate assets. We have absolutely nothing left." Patricia followed right behind him, weeping openly. She practically threw herself at Marcus, her hands reaching out to grab the lapels of his immaculate navy suit. Marcus stepped back swiftly, easily avoiding her desperate grasp. Patricia stumbled forward, her knees hitting the hard marble floor. She did not even try to stand back up. She stayed there practically on her knees, looking up at him with a tear-stained face. "Marcus, please," Patricia begged, her voice a ragged, pathetic sob. "You have to help us. The eviction at the main estate is scheduled for tomorrow morning. We are going to be thrown out onto the street. Victoria is drowning. She is filing for bankruptcy today. The credit card companies are coming after her. We just need a bailout. We just need a bridge loan to stop the bleeding." Richard nodded frantically, standing over his weeping wife. $500,000, Marcus. That is all we need to stop the immediate foreclosures. 500,000 is absolute pocket change to you. You can authorize a wire transfer right now and save this family. You have to do it." Marcus stood perfectly still. He looked down at the two broken, desperate people groveling at his feet in the middle of his corporate lobby. His expression did not soften. There was no pity in his eyes. There was only the cold, clinical detachment of a man looking at a bad investment he had already written off. "I am not your bank," Richard Marcus stated, his voice echoing clearly across the marble lobby. "I am not your savior. And as of 48 hours ago, I am no longer your son-in-law. Patricia let out a sharp, devastated gasp, covering her mouth with her trembling hands. My attorneys formally served Victoria with divorce papers this morning. Marcus continued, completely unyielding. I am actively liquidating every single joint asset we ever shared. You lied to me for years. Your daughter used my money to fund her pathetic infidelity. You brought this absolute ruin upon yourselves. I owe you nothing. Get out of my building before I have you arrested for trespassing. The finality in his words was absolute. Richard staggered backward as if he had been physically struck. All the fight completely drained out of him, leaving only a hollow, broken shell of a man. Patricia, however, was not ready to surrender to the abyss. Her frantic, searching eyes darted away from Marcus and finally registered my presence. She stared at me standing there in my tailored business suit, radiating calm authority, holding a designer leather tote bag that contained a contract worth more than her entire seized estate. The shift in her demeanor was instantaneous. The tyrannical mother who had mocked my business and belittled my existence completely vanished. In her place was a terrified beggar looking for any available lifeline. Patricia scrambled across the marble floor, closing the distance between us. She reached out her trembling fingers, clutching at the hem of my suit jacket. Valerie. Patricia pleaded, looking up at me with wide, desperate eyes. Valerie, you are my daughter. Please. We have absolutely nowhere to go. Richard is going to be indicted. We are entirely destitute. You have money now. You just took our house. You have a successful business. You have to save us, Valerie. You cannot let your own mother sleep on the streets. Please just give us something. I looked down at the woman who had spent 35 years making me feel completely invisible. I looked at the tears streaming down her face and the pathetic desperation in her grip. I felt the heavy gaze of Marcus and the security guards watching my every move. I did not yell. I did not gloat. I maintained absolute total silence. I slowly reached my hand into my designer purse. I bypassed the multi-million-dollar contract folder. I bypassed my sleek leather wallet. My fingers found exactly what I was looking for. I withdrew my hand, holding a single crisp paper bill. I held it out directly in front of Patricia's weeping face. Patricia stared blankly at the crisp piece of paper fluttering slightly from my fingertips. Her tear-filled eyes struggled to focus on the currency. For a split second, her delusion was so absolute that she actually thought I was handing her a blank check. She reached up with a trembling hand, her manicured fingers grazing the edge of the paper before the realization finally registered. It was $100 bill. A single $100 bill. Patricia looked up at me, her face contorting in complete shock and utter bewilderment. Her mouth opened, but she could not form a single coherent syllable. The sheer insult of the gesture short-circuited her brain entirely. Here, I said, my voice slicing through the heavy silence of the grand corporate lobby. You gave me exactly $100 and told me to figure it out when I left for college, carrying my entire life in a black plastic trash bag. The memory flashed brightly between us, an unspoken ghost materializing in the sterile corporate space. I remembered standing on their pristine driveway, shivering in the autumn air, begging for just a little help with my dorm deposit. I remembered Patricia tossing a crumpled $100 bill at my feet, telling me that if I wanted to waste my time studying art instead of business, I could fund my own inevitable failure. She had turned her back on me then, walking into her warm mansion and locking the heavy front door. Now the roles were completely irrevocably reversed. Use this to call an Uber, Patricia, I stated, dropping the crisp bill perfectly onto the marble floor right between her knees. Because you are absolutely not getting a single dime of my money. The poetic justice hit her like a physical blow. The absolute finality of my words shattered the very last remnants of her fragile delusion. Patricia did not scream. She did not yell. She simply crumbled. Her posture completely collapsed, and she dropped fully onto the cold marble floor, her face buried in her hands. Deep, agonizing sobs racked her slender frame. The polished, wealthy socialite was completely gone, replaced by a destitute, broken woman weeping over a single $100 bill on a public floor. It was the most pathetic thing I had ever witnessed. I felt no pity. I felt absolutely nothing but the profound, liberating weight of closure. I turned my back on her, adjusting my grip on my designer tote bag, preparing to walk out of the lobby with Marcus. The sound of Richard's furious roar echoed sharply against the high ceilings. "You ungrateful little brat," Richard bellowed, his voice completely unhinged, raw with desperate masculine fury. I heard the heavy scuff of his leather shoes slipping against the marble as he lunged. He could not handle the humiliation. He could not handle seeing his wife reduced to a sobbing mess on the floor, while the daughter he had tormented casually walked away holding millions. He surged forward, throwing his entire body weight toward me. His large hand shot out, his thick fingers grasping violently at the fabric of my tailored suit sleeve. He did not even manage to pull me backward. Before his grip could fully tighten, the air in the lobby seemed to explode into motion. Marcus did not even flinch. He simply took a single calculated step back, allowing the highly trained Pinnacle corporate security team to execute their exact protocol. Two massive security guards clad in immaculate dark suits materialized out of our peripheral vision with terrifying speed. The first guard slammed his forearm directly into Richard's chest, halting his forward momentum with a sickening thud. The second guard grabbed Richard's extended arm, twisting it sharply behind his back with practiced, ruthless efficiency. Richard let out a hoarse cry of pain as his center of gravity was violently ripped away. The guard swept his legs out from under him and tackled him directly onto the polished granite floor. The impact echoed like a gunshot. Richard's face was shoved hard against the cold stone, his cheek flattening uncomfortably against the very floor Patricia was currently weeping upon. "Get your hands off me!" Richard screamed, his voice muffled against the marble, struggling pathetically against the massive weight of the two guards pinning him down. "Do you know who I am? I am Richard Thorne. I own half this city. Let me go. You own absolutely nothing." Richard Marcus stated, his voice devoid of any emotion, looking down at the pinned man with total apathy. "You are a trespasser, assaulting a highly valued corporate client in my lobby." Marcus looked over at the lead security guard, who already had a radio pressed to his lips. "Keep him pinned until the police arrive to scrape him off my floor," Marcus commanded. I stood there watching the man who had terrified me for my entire childhood reduced to a thrashing, screaming spectacle. He looked so incredibly small. The terrifying giant of my youth was just an angry, pathetic fraud, being physically restrained by men half his age. I brushed off my suit sleeve where his fingers had briefly caught the fabric, restoring my immaculate professional appearance. Patricia was still sobbing hysterically, seemingly unaware that her husband had just been tackled a few feet away from her. The entire lobby had come to a complete standstill. Employees and visiting executives were watching the destruction of the Thorne family legacy in absolute stunned silence. Then the heavy automated revolving glass doors at the front of the grand lobby began to spin. The bright afternoon sunlight spilled into the room, illuminating the entrance, as two figures stepped decisively through the glass doors. They were not wearing corporate suits. They wore dark, practical windbreakers and jeans. Their expressions were severe, intensely focused, and entirely devoid of the shock that gripped the rest of the lobby onlookers. The bright silver shields of the Los Angeles Police Department hung heavily from chains around their necks, catching the light with every step they took. They walked past the reception desk, ignoring the wide-eyed staff. They bypassed the security guards, who were currently holding Richard firmly against the ground. They walked directly toward the center of the lobby, stopping exactly 3 feet away from where Patricia was huddled on the floor. The lead detective, a tall, broad-shouldered man with a closely cropped beard, looked down at the sobbing woman. He reached into his jacket pocket, pulling out a thick, folded legal document. "Patricia Ann Thorne," the detective called out, his deep, authoritative voice cutting entirely through the ambient noise of the lobby. Patricia flinched violently at the sound of her full legal name. Her sobbing hitched, and she slowly raised her tear-streaked, smudged face, looking up at the two towering detectives with wide, terrified eyes. "Patricia Ann Thorne," the detective repeated, unfolding the heavy document. "Stand up. We have a federal warrant for your immediate arrest." The entire corporate lobby went dead silent. The ambient hum of business negotiations and ringing phones simply vanished. Patricia stared at the silver badge flashing in the sunlight, and then down at the terrifying legal document. Her mouth opened and closed mechanically, but no sound emerged. She looked like a woman who had just been struck by lightning. There must be some mistake, Patricia finally stammered, her voice shaking violently, echoing in the cavernous marble room. I am Patricia Thorne. You cannot arrest me. I am a highly respected member of this community. The second detective stepped forward, his expression entirely unmoved by her wealthy suburban outrage. He reached to his belt and pulled out a pair of heavy steel handcuffs. There is no mistake, Mrs. Thorne, the detective stated, his voice flat and authoritative. You are being placed under arrest for multiple felony counts of federal wire fraud and aggravated identity theft. Identity theft, Patricia shrieked, her tear-streaked face turning stark chalky white. Whose identity? Your own daughter's, the detective answered. We have a comprehensive financial paper trail proving you deliberately stole Valerie Thorne's Social Security number 15 years ago. You used it to open dozens of fraudulent offshore credit accounts to fund your lifestyle. Furthermore, our cybercrimes division has the IP addresses and bank routing numbers linking you directly to the fraudulent GoFundMe campaign you launched last week. You actively solicited public donations under entirely false pretenses. Patricia looked as though all the blood had been drained from her body. Her knees wobbled and she slowly turned her head to look at me. The realization that her own arrogant, careless greed had finally trapped her in an inescapable cage was absolute. The safety net of her husband's money was gone, and her lies had finally caught up to her. Valerie, tell them, Patricia begged, extending her trembling, manicured hands toward me. Tell them it was a simple misunderstanding. I am your mother. Tell them you gave me permission to use your credit. Please, Valerie. I looked down at her, feeling nothing but a profound, icy detachment. I felt no sorrow. I felt no obligation. I gave you absolutely nothing, Patricia, I replied, my voice ringing clear and steady across the lobby. You deliberately stole from me when I was a struggling teenager, and you tried to steal from the innocent public when your husband bankrupted your estate. Enjoy your new life in a federal cell. The detective stepped around Patricia, grabbing her arms firmly and pulling them behind her back. The sharp metallic click of the handcuffs echoing through the quiet lobby sounded like a final, definitive gavel strike. Patricia began to wail, a high-pitched, horrific sound of total, absolute defeat as she was hauled to her feet by the detectives. Richard, who was still pinned firmly against the cold marble floor by the Pinnacle security guards, began thrashing wildly. You cannot do this to us! Richard roared, his face purple with manic rage and intense humiliation. Do you know who I am? I am Richard Thorne. I built the real estate market in this city. Let me go right now, or I will have all of your badges. I will sue this entire corporate firm into the ground. Marcus looked down at the screaming man and gave a sharp, dismissive nod to his lead security guard. Get this absolute trash out of my building, Marcus commanded. The massive guards hauled Richard up by his armpits. He kicked and screamed completely, losing the very last shred of his dignified, aristocratic facade. They dragged him roughly across the polished granite floor, his expensive Italian leather shoes scraping loudly against the stone. They shoved him violently through the revolving glass doors, tossing him out onto the concrete sidewalk like a bag of discarded garbage. The federal detectives marched Patricia right out behind him. Her head was bowed in absolute paralyzing disgrace as the dozens of lobby spectators openly recorded the entire pathetic scene on their smartphones. The heavy glass doors spun to a halt, leaving the lobby in a state of stunned quiet. Marcus reached into his tailored suit pocket and pulled out his cell phone. He looked at the illuminated screen, and a slow, cold smile touched the corners of his mouth. He looked over at me, tapping the screen with his index finger. My legal team just sent the official confirmation, Marcus announced, his voice carrying a dark, satisfying finality. The marshals just served Victoria with the divorce papers at the main estate. She was reportedly standing in the driveway screaming at the foreclosure agents who were actively locking the front iron gates. She has absolutely zero access to any of my corporate or personal accounts. Her platinum credit cards are entirely frozen. She is officially bankrupt, completely destitute, and homeless. I took a slow, deep breath, letting the reality of his words settle deep into my bones. It was over. The absolute dismantling of the Thorne family was completely finalized. They had spent their entire lives treating everyone around them like disposable pawns, entirely convinced their fake wealth and social status made them untouchable. Now they were facing massive federal jail time, complete social ruin, and absolute devastating poverty. They had lost everything, and they had lost it entirely because of their own arrogant, limitless greed and their pathetic, endless lies. I turned to Marcus, adjusting the strap of my designer tote bag on my shoulder, the bag holding the multi-million-dollar contract that would secure my empire for the rest of my life. "It seems we both have exactly what we want, Marcus," I said, my voice steady and brilliantly clear. "We eliminated the dead weight," Valerie Marcus replied, smoothing his silk tie and restoring his impeccable corporate armor. "We protect what we build." We walked toward the exit together, our footsteps echoing in perfect synchronization against the marble floor. The security guards respectfully stepped aside, holding the heavy glass doors open for us. I stepped out of the freezing air-conditioned lobby and into the bright, blinding California sun. The intense warmth washed over me, instantly burning away the last lingering chill of my toxic family history. The air tasted incredibly sweet. A sleek black executive town car was idling at the curb waiting for Marcus. He stopped by the open rear door and turned to face me. The ruthless corporate titan gave me a single slow, respectful nod. It was a silent acknowledgement between equals. Two people who had walked through the fire and emerged with empires. "I will see you at the downtown installation site next week," Valerie Marcus said, before sliding into the back seat. The tinted window rolled up and the heavy car glided away, merging seamlessly into the bustling city traffic. I walked over to my own luxury vehicle parked in the premier executive valet spot. It was a pristine jet black SUV, and it was paid for in full with my own hard-earned money. I unlocked the doors and slid into the driver's seat, gripping the soft hand-stitched leather steering wheel. The quiet, powerful hum of the engine purred to life. Before putting the car in gear, I reached into my purse and pulled out my cell phone. I opened the settings menu, my thumb hovering over the screen. For 15 years, I had kept the exact same phone number, always subconsciously waiting for the inevitable emergency calls. The demanding favors, the sharp criticisms, and the toxic drama that had defined my miserable existence. I navigated directly to the carrier settings and requested an immediate permanent number change. I deleted every single contact associated with the Thorne family, wiping Patricia, Richard, Victoria, and Harper from my digital life forever. I initiated a total absolute no-contact protocol. The screen flashed bright green, confirming the update. The old Valerie Thorne was completely dead and buried right alongside her pathetic, ruined family. I tossed the phone onto the passenger seat, shifted the car into drive, and pulled out into the bright, sunlit streets. I was driving toward my massive staging warehouse, toward my multi-million-dollar contracts, and toward a future I had built entirely with my own two hands. I was completely free. I was untouchable. And I was absolutely victorious.